So today I have two very special ladies who share a name. One you've already met, which is Elizabeth, now Appel, formerly Hefner. So she's joining us today. We're going to do a bit of a follow-up on a topic we've talked about before, which is critical thinking. And we've invited an expert local to the area where I live currently. And this is Liz Emmett-Maddox. And she used to be a philosophy professor at Georgetown University and has taught locally critical thinking and philosophy to young people. And so today's topic really revolves around some of the things we were discussing with critical thinking being an integral part of health and fitness and why it matters to those topics and how to navigate the ever so tricky world of fitness marketing. So there you go, Liz. Take it away.
Awesome. Well, so when Kris and I were talking about this, we started talking a little bit about Aristotle's rhetoric. I know, crazy, right? Because he was one of the very first people to really dial down what it means to persuade people and how to do it effectively and all of those kind of things. And what's amazing is that 2,000 plus years later, we're still seeing the same things in play. So actually, if you want to pop up that graphic, Kris, that's actually a super helpful place to start because people may have seen or heard in some form or fashion of this about this rhetorical triangle. So Aristotle wrote a whole treatise on what he called rhetoric, which was basically the art of persuasion.
Which I think is a super relevant topic because Elizabeth is my marketing person and she's a professional marketer, right? This is what she does for work. So I'm curious to know if this is something that was taught to you in school. Did you learn about the rhetorical triangle? Sorry, I almost got my words mixed up.
Was this to me?
Yeah. I know it's going to be confusing, right? I wish I could point, but like that doesn't work either because you don't know where you are. So
you know what? I did not go to the best schools. So I can't say, I feel like I didn't learn anything of real philosophical standards until I went to college.
Right. But in college, do you recall any of this material coming up?
Little bits and pieces. Not a lot, just a little bit. I feel like I've had to basically relearn critical thinking, or actually really just learn for the first time critical thinking with you, Kris. I feel like you and I are having an in-depth multi-quarter session.
Okay. Well,
I'll be curious, Elizabeth, to know when we start pulling these pieces apart. My guess is at least some of them will be familiar, even if you didn't get them with these particular labels, right? Yes. Because again, this is stuff that's still happening, still being used very effectively, even now.
And my parents, my family is very into philosophy. So it got, I absorbed it that way, but school, not so much.
Yeah. Well, and this wasn't a part of any curriculum I ever took either, because I came out of a very different pathway, right? So I think the big question really is like, if you're not actively taking philosophy, where is this critical thinking stuff presented nowadays? Or is it, or is it not? And maybe that's something we can get to a little bit later. But for now, I'm going to pop this triangle up here.
Well, and I'll actually just pop in to address that question really briefly. And that's when I was asked by my son's high school to step in for a teacher who was supposed to be teaching them a research paper writing block. And I don't remember what happened. They got ill or had some conflict and weren't able to do it. And kind of at the last minute, they said, "Oh, Liz, I bet you could do this." I was like, "Yeah, that would be awesome." And can I teach media literacy while we're at it? Because this was going to be one of their first introductions to online research. Mm-hmm. And as we know, there's amazing things on the internet, and some of it's even true.
Maybe 8 to 10% of it.
I mean, right? But then how do you
kind of true
parts that are true?
Yeah, what kind of true? Like personal truth?
Such an important thing for these high schoolers to be introduced to. I mean, they're digital natives. They are on the web. They're on their social media. They're doing their thing. And it just seems so important to me to say, awesome that you have access to all of this information. How do you sift through it? How do you discern what's true from what's not? And what are the cues? What are the clues that you use when you're researching? Again, this was, for an academic context, but what are the clues and cues that you use to say, this is a, legitimate research article. This is propaganda and all of that. So,
and this is funded by the company trying to sell you something, telling you what's what. Right? So, and I think this is where the line gets really blurry for people, because there's a lot of pseudoscience and a lot of especially product marketing that is presented from the perspective of scientific research nowadays. And I think it's really confusing for a lot of people. So understanding a little bit about how arguments are constructed, I think, is a huge component of being able to think critically, because if you can't see the root cause or the root motive underneath what somebody is saying, then how can you really understand their message, right? I think that's kind of what you're driving at. And that, this is clearly not being taught as a standalone set of tools in classes anymore.
Which is crazy, because just thinking about what kids are facing, like, you need to teach this at a younger and younger age now because of being bombarded by all this information out there. I'm having flashbacks, Liz, when you were talking, I was having flashbacks of, like, remember when you would just go to the library and you would find these books and you're all like, I'm pretty sure this is a pretty credible source. It got published, and I just remember growing up with a lot of that, not looking to Facebook for my information, not Googling and getting a bunch of sponsored content. And I feel really, really grateful that I didn't have to do all the critical thinking work growing up. Like, kids, I mean, if they even get exposed to it nowadays.
And as a parent of somebody who's, about to come up on some very challenging situations in her life, my daughter's entering middle school, or entered middle school this year. And, I think it creates a real blind spot for people of, like, my age and slightly younger and definitely older, because that is how we did research. There was a published encyclopedia, there was a source, or there were, like, films you would scroll through at the library, right? I remember having to do that for papers, and it was like, my eyes hurt and I don't care about this topic I'm researching, and this is really hard work. But at least I know what I find I can just use, because it's been vetted by a higher, like, body of oversight in some way, right? And I think this is one of the really sort of glaringly obvious failings of the internet, is that there is nothing required to put something on the internet. I mean, literally, Liz, you and I have created multiple websites just like that. And then they're live.
It's so
and
easy.
People can go. Yeah. Right. Nobody's ever checked anything on anything I've ever written.
Right. So, I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, and I'm a little bit older than both of you guys. So the burden of critical thinking, let's say, or the burden of discernment has been bumped down. Right. I mean, at one point, that was the job of book editors or newspaper editors or journal review committees. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, things had to go through peer review before they made it to the light of day. And not that mistakes didn't happen and sponsored content didn't sneak through in, pharmaceutical research or whatever. But even then, there was a standard that this had to be, your results had to be replicable, or you had to have two sources for the New York Times to print that, X said Y, right? So that burden in a certain way of critical thinking, not that it's ever been, non-existent if you just want to be a, human person in the world. But again, like you guys were saying, like the sources that you had access to, the books in the library, the newspapers that you read, the journal articles that were published, somebody else had done that work for us, basically. And at this point, you cannot count on that at all, especially when you're in the wild world of the internet, right?
Yeah.
Hopefully the New York Times and reputable newspapers still double source their information, right?
Hopefully.
Hopefully.
But the fact that we're talking about it says there's a doubt, right? Because I don't think there's enough transparency here either. And I think this is why, Liz and I have both repetitively come back to the fact that it's like, wait a second, people are rampantly using logical fallacies to present arguments that just don't hold water. And you can hear it all over the board. And this is not political, right? This is not a political discussion. This is 100% about, the motives behind why somebody's telling you something.
Right.
Right. And if it's always to sell you something, then you're polluting the waters, right? You are no longer just thinking, you're selling. At all times. And so I think there's some really problematic stuff there too. And so this is why, when we were talking about this, because we went to a tile shop, it was a super fun outing and it was a long drive. So we had a lot of time to sort of dig into this. And I thought, actually, this is really perfect for sort of what we're trying to build here, which is, hey, let's recreate those systems that were in place. Right. For people to be sure about the information that they're using to base their decisions on. Yeah. 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 So all right, let's go back in time.
So let's jump over to this triangle, because I think this gives us, kind of the puzzle pieces, and each one of them are super interesting. So again, if you hear anything about Aristotle's rhetoric, you'll hear three words: logos, pathos, and ethos. And he thought that these were the three building blocks of a persuasive argument, or any kind of persuasion. And he was talking to and about the orators in ancient Greece, and how you were going to, how you'd be most effective at persuading the representatives to vote for X instead of Y. But again, we see all of these pieces still in play all of these years later in every piece of marketing, every piece of advertising, every piece of good journalism or filmmaking or literature. I mean, they're just all there. Anything that, kind of is intended to move you into action and to make you do a thing is playing with these three pieces.
It's like basically the original behavior motivator, right? Like this is how I as a me got you as a you to do something I wanted you to do, right? This was the model.
And so what were the building blocks of that interaction, of that? How did that happen? Right? So ethos is about the speaker, the person sending the message. Pathos is about the audience, the one receiving the message. And logos is about the content of the message. That's kind of, the most basic breakdown of it. And so the ethos has to do with, what do you know? It's right. Let's do marketing speak. Do you know, like, and trust the person who's talking to you? Right? And what has gone into that knowing, liking, and trusting? And again, for different kind of messages, a different kind of speaker is appropriate.
Enter celebrity endorsements.
Enter celebrity endorsements. Enter, right, there's a difference between marketing done by, a doctor with a white coat and a stethoscope telling you blah, 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 and the, whatever Instagram model who says, oh, this is the thing I did and it can work for you too, right? I mean, different ethos, it's going to appeal to a different person, and it's operating on different kind of different levels, right? And somebody who they might be recommending exactly the same thing. They might be recommending exactly opposite things. Who knows, right? But what's going to catch your attention and the person you're most likely to believe, that's the question of ethos. And we can, kind of circle back around to that.
Well, I'm getting lots of ideas on the social behavioral side of this, really, because, what you're saying about this really talks to the idea of tribes, right? Like if a member of my tribe, somebody who's in my trusted group, tells me a thing, I'm more inclined to believe it than some rando from the village next door that I don't know. Right. So leveraging that sort of social connection is super useful when used for good.
Absolutely.
And incredibly dangerous when used for ill gains, right?
Right. Right. I mean, and we can also just dive in here and, you know, their blocks say trust, allure, and credibility. Again, I would say no, like, trust.
Yeah.
Right. It's the same thing. And, you know, of course, we could dive into a whole interesting conversation about what is it that makes someone likable, trustworthy, and knowable?
Mm-hmm.
How does the color of your skin or your gender or your age or any of those variables play into that?
Yeah, your job or your social status or your number of children or this is what I'm saying about this us versus them model that's always at play in human behavior, right? There's always an in crowd and an out crowd, which is not necessarily super useful for where we're at in society nowadays. Like it would be much more useful if we made a much bigger in group and a much smaller out group. But this is definitely human behavior at its base, right? Like I need to feel safe. And in order to feel safe, I need to know who I can trust. And that's based off of, you know, how much like me are they? How different from me are they? What experience do I have with them? Right. So credibility, you know, have they demonstrated something that they can do that I can't? And allure is like the funnest one we could talk about, right? From the point of view of like attractiveness, especially as it pertains to health and fitness. Because for a very long time, the only thing that gave you trust and credibility was your appearance in health and wellness. Right. Yeah. And how messed up is that? Right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a whole other podcast. That's a whole other conversation, right? Like,
right. Yeah. So, all right. So we can come back to this ethos bit because again, there's so much there. Pathos is, I mean, the word doesn't translate really well into English. You know, when we hear that, we think of like kind of pathetic and, you know, it's not an awesome word. But it's really just about what touches your emotions. How do you respond on an emotional level to what you're seeing, what you're hearing, what's coming at you? And again, this is part of a bigger context, right? Because, you know, what's sometimes shown is there's a big circle around the whole triangle that is the context.
I have another diagram that actually has that. I don't know if it's worth.
No. It's not that big a deal. Yeah, I like the other one better because it's
okay.
But yes, but just to say, you know, all that white space there is the context in which this communication is happening. So that's a thing worth noticing as well. And so pathos is this way of connecting to people's emotions, right? And that's what all good communication does. It makes you feel something, either about yourself or about the story you're hearing or about the world around you. And if it doesn't make you feel anything, it's useless. Basically, as communication, it's failed.
Yeah, well, absolutely.
And it's certainly not going to make you do anything, right? Because again, the part of this whole project is to get you to do a thing. And if you're not feeling any kind of emotion about it, whether it's inspired or terrified or worried, or and we can dive into those different emotions and the different motivations and how they impel us to action differently. But that's kind of the idea behind pathos, is like a message has to have some kind of emotional impact. It has to have an emotional connection. And so, and they also talk about values here, right? I mean, that's another thing. You know, if you are appealing to my values and says, a good human being would recycle all of their cans and bottles, right? Like that's a message we've been getting, right? We've heard that message. We're like, oh, I'm a good human being, right? That's going to impel me to a certain kind of action, not because I have an emotion about it necessarily, but because I identify with that value, right? I want to save the planet for my children and grandchildren. I think it's the right thing to do, right? So emotion, I guess all that to say, just, let's don't get too narrow a definition of emotion, because values are different than emotions, but they can move us to action in a similar way.
Often in a deeper way, because our belief systems, right, have a huge impact on our decisions.
Exactly.
And Liz, I know, we've talked before about pain points in marketing.
Right.
right? Like find a person's pain point and you can compel them to action. And oftentimes the most effective tool that you'll see used is fear. Fear is definitely the one that spurs the most action short term. And this is what's really fascinating about it, is that fear is functional short term, but long term, it's actually love or compassion or deeper values and priorities that are built into the society as a whole so that everything functions optimally, right? And you can see this play out in children's movies all the time. Like pick a children's movie, we could pull the plot line out and apply it here and be like, oh no, this person's creating fear and wants you to do this thing, but it's the wrong thing to do. Right. And if you do the right thing, which is the harder thing that's going to get you a better long-term outcome, you win. Right. Right. So it's like, it's really fascinating how many places this pyramid or this triangle pops up that you don't realize until you start dissecting it. Right. Which is what I was so excited about for today. It was because I was like, let's put some real life, examples into this too, where this is ever present in culture. This is ever present.
Absolutely.
And something I'd be really fascinated to know. I know we want to get through to the other corner too, but like this is a very Western approach, right? So when we learn philosophy, and for example, if you're a philosophy professor in the Western world, do you only study Aristotle's rhetoric, or do you get another model from an Eastern culture as well?
I did not. That may have changed, but no. Typically, philosophy in Western universities is Western philosophy.
It's Greek, right? Yeah.
I mean, that's
I'd love to know what the other models are, right?
Yeah. I mean, you can have a class on Eastern philosophy and, or comparative philosophy or things like that. But no, pretty standardly, the baseline model is definitely going to be the philosophy that started with the Greeks and is trucking on.
How powerful is it that this framework has basically formed the foundation for communication in multiple languages in the Western Hemisphere, right? Like that's nuts to contemplate when you really kind of think about the impact of that.
Right. Yeah. And I guess what I will say is that Aristotle thought that he was codifying what he had observed as effective maneuvers. Right. Yes. And then sort of like, detailing is like, okay, well, if you really want to, persuade your fellow, electors, voters in the public, here's how to do that. So it was kind of a combination of observation and then prescription. Right. So yeah, I think there's a lot to dig into in this corner of the grid of the triangle. But let's just jump up to logos and then we'll circle back around. So logos is the content of the message, the words, the images, the graph that shows the profits going up if you do X, Y, or Z, or all of those kind of things. And these are supposed to be the facts of the matter, right? Sort of verifiable, observable, the facts.
And irrefutable things that, are non-negotiable.
Exactly. And, here's the little bubbles up here, logic, reason, proof. It's the intellectual appeal, right? So again, any one of these without the others falls flat. I mean, we've all sat through presentations and it's just like the Charlie Brown going, mom, 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 right? Data. I mean, I don't know. This is probably a mean thing, but I sort of think of insurance salesmen, right?
Yeah. I mean, maybe they've come a long way too, right? Maybe they started in the logic, in the logos area and they've moved over a bit, right?
But that's kind of what I imagine, right? It's like, okay, well, here's the risk and here's the
Right. What they really need is Will Smith to come in and sell insurance, right? Totally.
But this has to be there. This has to be there, right? Because if you are trying to persuade somebody of a concrete outcome in the world, presumably you have some data, you have some experience, you have something to offer that says, yes, if we choose path X, here's the likely outcome. If we choose path Y, here's the likely outcome. I really think X is the better way, and here's why, right? I mean, that's all. And I mean, honestly, like at one point in the world, I feel like this was kind of the most no-brainer part of it. Like there were facts that we could all mostly agree on.
Back in the day.
Stage of the game. This is a freaking wild card.
But I think it speaks to the power of the other two corners, right? Because if yes, you have somebody who's persuasive enough and who has enough emotional pull, it gets a little blurry, right? This whole fake news thing and the idea that there are alternative facts. I remember hearing that for the first time and just being like, what is happening? Because how can you possibly construct what most people will call civilized argument or conversation out of just fabrication, right? Because that's where we're headed if we're not careful and if we don't give equal weight to the three corners. Right.
Yeah.
Makes me rub my imaginary beard. I'm Greek, so I'm, any day it's coming in now. So
yeah. So actually, now that we've just sort of, given like a little thumbnail of these, Elizabeth, do these sound familiar to you in your marketing training?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, hyper aware of these always, yet not always thinking about this chart and the breakdown.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that it's not presented as this anymore, but that it's clearly used. I can remember something very, very similar to this in sales training I've had.
Yeah, exactly.
But it was never, ever labeled as philosophy or anything.
Well, again, because what's the object of sales training? You want a person to do a thing.
Right.
Right? So you lean on all of these different pieces.
I would love to know if there's an alternate model for this. Like, did somebody else in the world come up with another way to persuade people of things? Or is this really the best way, right? Like,
that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, honestly, in the place that I think you would look for that would probably be in
the internet. No, sorry.
Facebook.
I was going to say graduate programs in marketing.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, right. In marketing, huh?
That's that. If anybody's going to have done research into, is there a better way? Is there a different way? I would think it would be those folks.
I think it would just be maybe a slight change to the model. I doubt it would be actually a full-blown remodel.
Right.
I mean, just looking at this already, I'm like, it's all logos. Like, you don't really need logic, reason, and proof. Really, you just need the allure, like the hint of it. The illusion of like, you see this study here, you see this graph. Now, don't look at the bottom. Don't look at the bottom. Don't look how I skewed this information or like it paid for this information. See this graph? That looks good to you, doesn't it? It's a graph.
Right. It's visual, it's social proof, right? And this comes back to behavior psychology and just understanding how the human brain fundamentally works, right? Until very recently, we didn't have a lot of ability to generate a lot of fake facts, right? Like nature was pretty straight up factual. And that was what we had, like it's raining. Yeah. You can argue with me whether or not it's raining at your house, but like I can put my hand out and it gets wet and it's raining, and so as we've evolved into a more like intangible sphere of things like services versus just straight up products or tangible resource exchanges, this becomes more fluid and more difficult to pin down. And so I think it's a really interesting time to be talking about this framework, right? Because is it still the absolute best? Like, because then we could argue, how do you define proof?
Right. Well, and, I don't want to like go off on a really weird tangent, but, one of the advancements is that for so long, only certain people were considered to have access to truth, right? And those were white dudes with degrees and, If they said a thing, they would be believed. And their study participants who are like, yeah, actually not. Right? We're completely dismissed. Their experience, their truth was dismissed out of hand if anybody ever even heard it. Mm-hmm. Right? So this question of logos and truth and facts, I mean, it's complicated in interesting ways and not necessarily for the worse, right? Because there are more voices in the conversation. And that's a good thing.
It now becomes a problem of trying to triage all of that information, though, for accuracy. And I think this is, it seemed at first glance we were going to spend a lot of time on the bottom half of the pyramid, right? Because that seems where the juicy stuff is. But super oddly, in the world of today, it's actually up in the logos area, a lot of the questions, because it is this idea that, knowledge was restricted, education was restricted, even literacy, people weren't allowed to learn to read for centuries, right? And we could
and they weren't allowed to, more importantly than, so I'm just going to interrupt you, more importantly than not being allowed to read, they weren't allowed to write.
Yeah.
Right? So they weren't allowed to share their experience and have their knowledge make it into the world.
Yeah. Which makes you question the framework upon which all of our societies are built, really, when you look at it. And that's why I was saying from this Western perspective, this seems irrefutable. It seems like there couldn't possibly be a different model that would work as effectively. And that's part of your brain trying to create a framework within which you can function, right? So it's useful. But it's also super duper important to question those things, because when you don't know if, again, you've not got proof, right? If you've not tried anything but a Starburst, you don't know if Skittles are better or not. Like you just, it's another rainbow candy, who cares? But like, they're not the same.
Right.
And you can have a preference, but you can't like logic your way out of it. There's going to be factually the fact that Skittles are better, obviously.
And, for better or worse, I feel like there's enough here in any marketing message to keep us busy for a while.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
I mean, we could take any ad and we could say, okay, so who's behind this? Right. Mm-hmm. Do I know them? Do I like them? And I trust them. Should I know them, like them, trust them? Right. Are they a legitimate authority? Right. Are they the right person to, should I have any faith whatsoever in this person?
I love that nobody was going to call me on the Skittles thing either, because like, obviously you all agree it's the best candy, right? Obviously.
Always.
I just like chocolate. I don't care about Skittles or Starburst, Chris. That's why I'm not arguing.
See, but you're not allowed to read or write, Liz. So
I guess
it's okay. But I think it's really important to look at these, they may be somewhat silly examples in this context, but I think this is the kind of data skewing and bias that's really important to identify when you create a paradigm for yourself to make decisions, right? Because it's like, this is from all of the, cross-cultural training and work that I've done, is like, it really, really forces you to take a look at your assumptions. Mm-hmm. Everything is an assumption. You can't function without them. Or you just never make a decision. You'd be like a useless blob of too many facts and ideas, right? But at the same time, how you decide to keep certain beliefs and get rid of others has a huge impact on who you trust, right? Mm-hmm. How they're credible, like in what sphere they generate credibility, what emotions they create in you as well, right? So when you have a group of people that share a set of beliefs, you can create a set of rules and systems that will manipulate their behavior better than another culture, right? Which is why marketing looks super different everywhere you go. Like a message that would sell pasta to Italians would not sell pasta to Americans. Same product, totally.
It is interesting, message. Like just looking at my Instagram and anything where there are these advertisements that are obviously set, I think, for global consumption and targeting. I get a lot of these weird games that, it's like a makeover game or something where it shows a woman where it's like, like this virtual little cartoon woman where it shows her in like this plot line where if she doesn't dress well or shave her legs or something, this guy will not be interested in her. And I'm just like sitting there with my American, 90s child, like feminist, ideals. And I'm just like, I am so offended right now. And I'm like looking at this also as a marketing professional, like this is not, to me, I'm like, this doesn't look made for American audiences. Like this really doesn't read for American audiences. And just how much with social media, how much kind of odd things are out there, what we perceive as odd, but make complete sense in other cultures.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's funny. I was on a call with a coach just before we got on here, and I can't remember what brought it up, but I was talking about something about all of the podcast likes we've gotten from Egypt. And it brought up a story about when I was teaching in France. I was teaching he was Egyptian. He spoke English fluently, but he needed to learn French to live in France. So I was teaching him French. His wife spoke fluent French and English and refused to leave the room while I was teaching him because men and women should not be alone in a room together unless they are married. And this was a massive problem for her, that I was a female teacher teaching her husband another language. And she was extremely involved in the teaching process, mostly in the form of yelling at her husband. And it became a real contentious place because it was like, I can't actually teach him French if you're going to yell at him in English the entire time about his sucky French. Like, this isn't moving us forward. And so in the end, the solution was she sat outside the door. I told her, I said, I need you to not be visible to him so that he can focus on what I'm saying. You can leave the door cracked, but if you inject any commentary, I'm going to ask you to move your chair 5 feet every time you say something, because I didn't know what else to do with it. Because it was like, I just couldn't get any progress with this poor guy, because every time she would yell at him, he would just sort of like shut down again. And it was super fascinating, because from the outside, when I start telling that story, people are like, oh, men and women can't be in the same room. Men are terrible. And in this particular situation, it was actually the woman creating the conflict in the situation over this perception that men and women could not be in the same room, even though it was a professional environment. And so when you start to change your frameworks and you start to say, okay, this makes sense, and this reads perfectly well for this audience, but not for that one. Like, why? And why do we all have such different beliefs when we all exist in the same, air bubble? It's like we have this little thin air bubble.
Right.
And yet we still seem to be able to argue about everything. It's like, there's so much in common. We should be able to come to a series of facts and truths that are irrefutable, that we can then build some of these other things from.
I mean, maybe social media will actually be the saving grace in this way. Maybe it starts out as kind of like this horrific thing, which it really has turned into, and become like, oh, we can all operate as one in a beautiful way, not a creepy Borg Star Trek way.
Creepy Borg Star Trek. I mean, that's a beautiful thought. I really,
wouldn't that be great?
Is the case. And it always is a messy process, right? Yeah. So as a philosophy professor, this again comes back into your wheelhouse of, you've had to study the rise and fall of these ancient civilizations, I'm sure, along with some of this other stuff, right? And there's an arc, right? And it's messy.
It's messy. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what's interesting to me is, and a concern that I have, I mean, I love your, this, maybe social media can, kind of help us all understand one another better. What is concerning to me is where I see the pockets forming, and then also the homogenization of global life, right? I mean, almost every continent has English as its predominant language now, and we're losing native languages because there's no one else, they're not being taught in the same way. Everybody's like, yeah, fuck it, we'll just learn English. Right? Like,
yeah. Well, there are pockets of this.
I love that.
Yeah, there were pockets of this historically, right? You know, French was the international language for a really long time, and Greek and Latin, and you can see all of this spread. And even within, you know, East Asian dynasties, I guess, or empires, you would see this too, right? But this is the first time it's been on a global scale.
Right.
Mm.
Right. Yeah.
So it's got interesting repercussions, right?
Well, and it makes sense with a lot of the buying power in English-speaking countries, specifically America.
Right.
So, you know, everyone has to learn that language if you want to dominate the marketplace.
Mm-hmm. It's true.
And I mean, one of the things I wonder, and Kris, you would be the one to answer this. I feel like other countries are much more interested in teaching languages aside from their native language than the US is. Mm. There's very little focus and legitimate emphasis on the need and desire and value in learning other languages in most elementary through high school education. In my observation.
A lot of it, you're 1,000% right. I mean, I think a lot of it is proximity based.
Yeah.
Because if you just look at Europe alone, you have 25 member states. Well, 24. Thanks, England. But you have 24 member states, and within 2 hours drive of each other, you've got completely different languages with different language roots. You've got Slavic languages, Romance languages, Germanic languages. You know, it's a lot going on. And then you have, as you dig back, I unfortunately did have to study a lot of this in my French degree in college. I studied medieval French and the origin of French as it split off from German, and I think it was the Angles had their own dialects as well. And so you get this Anglo-Saxon kind of split, you get the Germanic split, and then you get the Romance language split. And the overlap of those languages at the time was super interesting because of the fact that of what we spoke about previously, which was very few people were able to read and write and learn. And so it was much slower, the written translations of things. And what actually happened was there were these like 1% at the top who could read and write the language of the land, and then all of these dialects below. And what they found was they couldn't communicate effectively with all of the tribes without generating a common language. Mm-hmm. And so this is where you got the split of these languages, was in an effort to communicate with the peasantry.
Right.
Right. But they had to take some and leave some. And so it's a really interesting, like you could dig way back into the origins of each of the modern languages that we see today. And you can look at the tribal languages and just how different they are in places that have less mainstream, for lack of a better word. That's a really shitty word for that. But like mainstream languages, like the top 10, right? If you go to Africa, you can throw a rock and hit 6 different languages within a few square miles. Same within, you know, on a way lesser scale, you go to England, you drive 2 miles, somebody's accent is a completely different accent, like unintelligible to 2 miles away. And that speaks a lot to people's movement patterns over time, and how, you know, how stationary you have to be to develop a completely different dialect to the village next door. Right. So it talks, you know, back to your point about the globalization of English. It's a huge tool. Right? It's a huge tool for communicating with more people and generating common ideas. However, it has its drawbacks in the loss of some of the individual cultural perspectives that we had. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer to that, but it was a really good question, right? And I think this is why I feel like so many of the liberal arts need to overlap better in college, because we all get in our corners, you know, and we get deeper and deeper into our one pocket. But actually, it's really hard to separate culture from philosophy, from, you know, language, because they're all part of the same, from history, because they're all part of the same thing, and they all happened because of each other. Right. So, you know, I think the point of today is really to give people an understanding of what's being used to sell them something. Right. The second component is, what do you do about it once you recognize it? Right. So I think maybe shifting back over to the critical thinking chart. This is Bloom's taxonomy, which we can also dive into if you want to. But this framework that I pulled up before about, like, how do I take information in? What do I do with it once I've got it? How do I vet it? How do I come up with my own ideas? How do I then talk to other people about my ideas? And then what do I do once I'm done with that process? And how many times do I iterate that? Right. So I'd love to hear sort of how you address this topic in your classes. Like, where did you really start with people, kids, I guess, really?
So when I was doing the critical media, the media literacy training, honestly, we started with who's the speaker. Right. And so
ethos, right? You started with ethos.
Right. Exactly. Who is this, who's the author of this article? What's behind, is it, now we have is it a sponsored? Is it not sponsored? What's the publication? Where, again, is it sponsored by air quotes, reputable news source? And I handed them out there's a great, and it's a work in progress. So it's I forget I can look up the name of it. It's basically like a media bias chart. And it's like this bell curve of left leaning to right leaning, and then highly, reliable versus unreliable. You know the one I'm talking about? Have you seen this? Yes, that's it.
I'm like, this rings a bell. Hang on, let me get it.
Literally.
Yeah. So I would hand that out to them, and then we would talk a little bit about, where do you get your information? Right? Are you reading BuzzFeed all day long, or do you dip into the New York Times? Right?
BuzzFeed's not credible?
Well, I didn't say it. They said it.
Sorry, BuzzFeed.
Sorry, BuzzFeed.
Well, they put out a lot of information, which would make you think that they're not credible. So,
well, right, and again, this is these are dealing into the finer points, right? Is everything that BuzzFeed puts out wrong? No, obviously, right? But are they the most reliable source when you want to know? I don't know.
It's like, I love to put this in middle school perspective for my daughter. It's like, you have 5 friends, right? One of them, anything they say, you're pretty sure is complete bullshit. You know it because they've proven it to you over and over again that what they say isn't reliable. One friend is kind of the whistleblower who goes, I don't think that's true. And then you have like 3 other friends along that spectrum somewhere, right? Like, exactly. And so if you can pick a friend and decide what news organization represents that friend or vice versa, you have a pretty good idea of whether or not you should take everything they say or what percentage of what they say.
Right. And in what domain. If I want to know what the, hippest thing to watch on Netflix is, absolutely, BuzzFeed, bring it on. What do you like?
Sure. Totally. Screen Rant.
Yes.
That's my Screen Rant, right? Like, yeah.
Yes. I will listen to BuzzFeed on that topic.
I think that's a really important concept too, because it can be highly topic based. Like, nobody's an expert in everything, right? So who are you listening to and what's their credibility again? Right.
Yeah. Like when you're listening to celebrities and their deep political analysis and you're like, I don't know about that.
Right.
Boy, I had somebody jump to mind like immediately. There's one out there right now who's doing all sorts of very deep political analyzing, but I'm not going to name any names because, but I think this is a really interesting place to start with critical thinking, right?
And then there's the question of so there's like the who's the speaker, and then there's the why. Why are they doing this? Why are they sending this message? Why have they written this article? Why are they doing this podcast, right? Is it to educate? Is it to inform? Is it to sell? Is it to sell under the guise of educating or informing, right? Like all of those kind of, and I think those are kind of, like if you're going to boil it down to 3 basic motivations, it's those, right? And again, my son is a, 22-year-old. He loves like comedian podcasts. Right. He listens to a lot, he gets a lot of his entertainment. That's, he listens to a lot of entertainment messages. If they try to mix in some selling or something, would he snag it? I don't know. Right. It's like all in the entertainment. Right. Yeah. So again, so just being able to pick out those motivations. And then again, like who's behind that? right? I mean, as I've, said to my students, the main message, the main thing any news outlet, any website, anything wants to do is to keep you there. They want to keep your eyeballs as long as possible because guess what? At the end of the day, somebody's selling something, right? Even the New York Times, even NPR, right? All of our, whatever our, kind of things at the top of this list are, right? They've got advertisers that support what they're doing. And so that's, again, in a reliable, well-run news organization, editorial is on one side, advertising is on the other, and never the twain shall meet. In sketchier organizations, there's, even our beloved Boulder Camera, there's the advertorial. Right?
Advertorial. Ooh.
You heard that word? Oh,
no,
yeah.
I've not. That's a new one. I had a physical response to that word, though.
Yeah, there's a thing called an advertorial. And it'll say, again, similar to sponsored content. And, maybe it's a real estate piece on the greatest new development in Longmont.
And I think this is right. And this is why critical thinking is becoming more and more relevant to master, because they're blurring lines left and right, and it's something I tell clients all the time is, and it's the time of year where everybody has tried a new exciting diet or product or something and come from a credible source. Probably they're somebody they've been following, somebody they generated trust in, somebody that they think knows what they're talking about. And I always say, like, at the end of the day, at the end of whatever message they're giving you, if there is an opportunity to buy something, you really, really need to check the credibility, because no one who is trying to get your money for something has pure motives, or nobody has motives for you, right? Because by nature, if I'm selling you something, I am going to profit from that. I benefit from that. Right. And at that point, now it's like polluted waters. And I've had this conversation so many times with other coaches when they're trying to sell coaching. Right. They're like, okay, I'm developing these packages and I'm guaranteeing results to people. And I'm always saying, right, but like, you're making a promise you're not in control of. Right. So now you're putting yourself in a really tricky spot, because if you're not careful, this impacts your credibility. And you see all sorts of defense mechanisms pop up in coaching around this, of trying to defend my results versus somebody else's, or my method being better versus somebody else's, to try to sort of morally whitewash this for themselves. And it's a really deep thing that happens. I don't think very many people do this like consciously. But it creates a setup where you can't just educate if you're selling. You can't. Right. I think that's one of the very few things I'll take a hard line on. But if you're actively selling something, you can't possibly be educating.
And that's why we have no sponsors.
We have no sponsors. And I will say now, like, it'll be a cold day in hell before I sponsor anything, because I don't want that to be associated.
Well, what if like a great brand as the marketing
don't
person?
Care. I don't. I've actually turned down brands I know as the marketing person. You're like, but Kris,
but Kris.
No. I had this argument once with a girl who was working for me, and we were, she was working on building my Instagram profile at the time, and she was like, well, this product wants you to just say something about them, and I was like, no, I just won't do it. Like, for me, it's a hard line, because as soon as I start doing that in any way, I'm polluting my credibility as far as I'm concerned. And maybe I'm a purist and it'll bite me in the ass, which it probably will, but I'm okay with that.
I think it really depends. Like if a brand came to you that was like some bullshit fitness nutrition shake that was full of a bunch of crap, and you're like, yeah, I'm totally gonna, I would be out. I'd be like, I'm not doing that. But if, something not even in our wheelhouse, but a product that you liked and you're like, yeah, I think people would enjoy hearing about this, and it has nothing to do with fitness and nutrition. Still like shaking your head. You're like, no,
I still wouldn't touch it, because again, it's like, that's 100% perspective based. Right. The line is hard.
What if it's a sock company that sells fuzzy socks?
Nope. Just no. Right. Because again, like and maybe this is where I'm particularly rigid, but it's a slippery slope.
Yeah.
It is.
You know, and
you're like, oh, they gave me a little money.
Totally.
They gave me a little money. And then Lululemon came in and they're like, well, we have a lot of problematic issues with our brand, but why don't we pay
We
you
have fuzzy
more money?
socks. You promoted fuzzy socks over here. So why won't you promote fuzzy socks here? You're opening a door, right? And it doesn't mean it's going to lead to anything. I'm sure if there was like fuzzy socks or whatever, and they wanted us to promote them, is there a moral conflict there? Not immediately, no. But it is this slippery slope, and it allows in a lot of arguments that I don't want to get into, you know? And I think that I'm actually thinking back, Liz, to how this conversation started was because we were upstairs in my house. Liz and I are neighbors. I should probably say that at some point, but we're neighbors. That's how we met. And in my room, when I was homeschooling my daughter last year in her office, I have these posters up on biases and logical fallacies. And they're just in my kid's room because I want them ever present in her mind when people are talking to her, that, you know, there's a motive. Right. People have an agenda. That's part of why we communicate with each other. If we didn't need stuff from each other, we wouldn't have developed language in the first place. Right. So it's not all bad, but it's important to understand what somebody else wants from you when they're communicating with you so that you can make educated decisions for yourself, which I think is the point of critical thinking.
And the best kind of communication, I mean, it's easy to kind of like slide down the slippery slope and go, oh my God, everybody's manipulative. It's all scammy, blah, blah, blah. But let's face it, I'm thinking about in our personal relationships, like when we're really clear about what we need and want from another person, like, you know, when you've been married for almost 30 odd years, right? That's actually a really good thing. And when somebody can clearly say, yes, I can do that, or no, I can't do that, or how about we meet in the middle on this or that, right? Like, that's awesome communication. Like, that's when it all works really well. And when somebody is super clear and says, hey, I've got this thing, and I want to sell you this water bottle right here.
Great. Maybe I want your water bottle, but at least I know what's going on here, right? There's transparency.
And then I can say a clean yes or a clean no, and it's just clean, right? I mean, I think where we all start to feel icky about it is when it's not clean.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's where kind of, you know, just to, you know, kind of dial it back. So that's where, you know, kind of asking these questions about the speaker, right? And we all have that. I feel like we have an internal sense about when somebody is speaking to us in a clean way and when somebody's speaking to us in like kind of a muddy, icky way, right? And that just doesn't feel good. And if we can put our finger on why, like, oh, yeah, that feels kind of gross because you said you were going to make me laugh, but now you're trying to sell me a water bottle.
Here's the thing. Here's rule number one. If anyone is really charming, never trust them, ever, or get in a relationship with them.
I had like 9 thoughts about that, but I think
charming people should not be trusted.
I think it's interesting because, again, I think it's like back to the sponsorships thing for just a second, because what we've just said is really, I think, such a critical point, is that it's fine when the motives are clear, right? Like if you come to me as a nutrition client and you say, I want you to tell me different things to eat, and I tell you different things to eat, but nobody's paying me to tell you what to eat.
Right.
Like if I don't tell you to eat tomato, or if I tell you to eat tomatoes, right? You don't think that the Tomato Growers Association is
sponsored by the Tomato Board
sponsoring me, right? Like, but if I tell you, you need to take these 5 supplements,
right?
Immediately there's another level there. And I think this is the thing, you know, why I'm so hardline about sponsoring anything is because then it pollutes my recommendations for anything. Right. So I'm perfectly happy to tell you things that I like or like to use, but I'm never going to take any money from them because now it's disingenuous.
Right.
Even if I still really do like that thing, I still think it muddies the waters.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? And I'm
absolutely.
I'm just thinking about going to like doctor's offices, and when they recommend random medication, it really freaks me out because you're always like,
That used to be illegal, right? There was a very clear decision made. I can't remember what year it was. where before this, marketing of prescription drugs to the public directly was illegal. And it is illegal in almost every other country. Right. There are only like 3 or 4 other countries, I think, and don't quote me on that number because I obviously have not done specific research on that. I am not a credible source. But it's a very small number of places where this is allowed. And if you watch international commentary on America, when people talk about things that are different in the US, it's one of the top 10 that you can watch a drug commercial in your home and you can go to a doctor and they will specifically market you a drug. That is an America thing. And it speaks to why we started this podcast in the first place, which was the polluting of the healthcare system to a for-profit system that makes it very hard for the person entering into a care situation to understand the motives of the people who are serving them.
Right.
God, did you guys see that prescription medication commercial that was being endorsed by Khloe Kardashian?
Oh no, really? I
don't know how this popped up. I think because I subscribe to Peacock, that streaming service, and you get commercials on it. And Khloe Kardashian popped up with this prescription medication, ad. And I was like, what is this for? Because they never actually outright tell you. I don't understand why they don't just tell you what it's for. I'm like, I don't know. But I was so curious because I'm like, well, if they have a Kardashian doing it, then it must be, butt related or lip related or something to make your butt and lips bigger. I don't know. But it was like a headache. It was a medicine for headaches. And I was like, you paid Khloe Kardashian, God only knows how much money for a headache medicine? Wow.
Well, when we were watching the Olympics a few months ago, there was, I think it was like a migraine medication. They were showing these various Olympic athletes who, suffer from migraines. And then in the very tiny print, it said, I don't know, so-and-so does not take blah, 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 blah drug.
Really?
Like, okay.
That is so gross.
Right?
Even though I'm in marketing, I'm like, I'm really grateful because the marketing I do is for like these small to medium-sized businesses where they're just like, I sell this product and or service and, I just want people in my area to know about it or something, and then other people are like, like a lot of B2B stuff. And other people are like, oh yeah, I need that. That's great. It's none of this weird, sometimes, but it's often not this weird manipulative, like you don't really need this, but Khloe Kardashian.
Well, and I've done, when I for a short while had a small internet-based business, I did a ton of marketing training, and the ones that I liked were the ones that were like, okay, we're not going to do gross marketing. We're going to do like, here's who I am, and here's what I have to offer, and you want it? Awesome. Here's how you get it. You don't? Cool. I still love you. Right? Like it was not, it was really about not gross marketing. So I guess
some industries can do that.
What's that?
Some industries can do that. It's completely fine. But with health and fitness, it's so oversaturated. Right. No one's playing a non-gross game except for Kris, who won't get even endorsed by socks.
Well,
yay, not gross.
Yay. Well, and I think part of it, maybe just to like kind of wheel us around to the second part of the triangle, part of what makes it gross is the kind of emotions that people are working with.
Yeah.
Right. So, and it's just what you said at the very beginning, Kris. It's like when you're marketing, when your persuasion, when your messaging is eliciting feelings of fear or being left out or not being cool or like all of those kind of things, you feel icky. Mm-hmm. Is it going to move you to action? Sure, sometimes. More than we might like to admit, right?
Short term. Yeah, short term. It will. But the problem is that this has been the marketing strategy for long enough that we're now seeing systemic issues of depression and inadequacy in people because the consistent messaging that they're getting from marketing is they're not good enough.
Right.
No matter what they do, they're not good enough. And there is a product to fix it. And so you've trained generations. And I think back to watching cartoons on Saturday mornings as a kid, like we were really one of the first generations where that was a thing.
Yeah.
And just the manipulativeness of the marketing really escalated over the time that I was growing up, and then to seeing some of the things that come out now. It's like you're told from a very young age that unless you have this thing or look this way or do this thing, that you're not good enough.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you get is actually like mental health issues in the greater population around this. You get anxiety because people are constantly being told that there's something to be afraid of. You get depression because they can't do anything about it and they can't live up to the standard that's being presented. So then you get drugs marketed for depression and anxiety, perfect solution to the problem they created. And it's like it's a mind-blowing circle.
Right.
And I think the answer is community, right? Because when you look at the base of this pyramid, it functions off of communication and how people communicate with each other, right? So yes, this can be used for ill and is, but we can turn it around, right? We can choose to focus on logic and reason and proof and maintain morals that are important to us, whether you believe that marketing is fundamentally evil as I do. Just kidding. I mean, it's not fundamentally evil, but like, I'm not going to endorse any products. And that's a line for me that I've chosen specifically because of the blurry lines in the field that I work in.
Right.
And anytime I step over that, and I've had multiple opportunities to do so, it's not that nobody's ever come to me saying, wear my yoga pants and take a picture of your ass and put it up on Instagram and we'll give you money. That has happened, and could I have done that? Sure, I could have done that. Would people have looked at my ass? Yeah, that's not cool. I don't really want that either. So it's not part of my overall marketing message, because I'm not sitting here trying to say I don't have a marketing message.
Of course. Right.
Of course I do, but it's not that.
Yeah.
It's not product based. I'm not here selling you a thing that's going to solve all of your problems.
Right.
I am genuinely trying to show up in the space as an educator.
Right.
So as long as that's my goal, I can't be promoting products, or I'm not an educator anymore.
Right.
I'm a salesperson.
Well, and that's a difference, because so think about what are the emotions that an education message elicits. Right?
That's a good question. Yeah.
It's like empowerment, it's possibility, it's excitement, right? Those motivate us to action. And that's a good thing, right? I mean, when you've had hopefully we've all had this, experience, like you go to a class, you're like, oh my God, that's like the most fascinating subject ever. And then you like dive down your own little rabbit hole, right? Like that's motivating to action. And so those are emotions. If we can figure out how to dial those in, right? How do we elicit these emotions of, again, excitement, possibility, ambition, not in a weird way, but aspiration, again, not in a weird way. Right. Yeah, exactly. There we go.
This is how you do that.
Moving up the ladder. How do we move ourselves up the ladder?
Right. Yeah. Rather than back down.
Right.
Yeah. And I think it's funny because, I learned about this years ago in college, right? And I didn't think about it for a very long time after that. And it's come up in a couple of courses I've taken recently, because I think the narrative and the conversation around this is really shifting. And it so gives me hope, because there is pushback against this manipulative messaging that's coming out. And this is how we're doing it. We're using old tools, right? We're saying, hey, this is a thing, and we've already looked at this, and we know how this works. And we know that when people focus on positive emotions, when people focus on accomplishment, achievement, and success, not in a I don't have it kind of way, but in a look what I've accomplished, and I gained this knowledge, I understand it, now I know how to use it, I can then analyze how I used it, right? And I could put it together with other skills that I have, and then I can also evaluate that and turn that into more skills and more actionable events. That's the long-term win, right? We talked about fear and manipulation being the short-term emotions that generate a negative slide. This is the long-term positive outcome of using these kinds of momentums to generate action, but they're not as immediate as fear.
Right. Yep.
So it's trying to talk people into going for the longer game.
Yep.
Right. This is why
it's a hard sell.
It can be a hard sell because there's so much contradictory messaging currently.
Yeah. And it's a hard sell. It's a hard sell until you get to, for most people, I think, get to a certain point in your life. I think you and I talked recently, Kris, about your motivators and you're often in your 20s versus in your 30s versus in your 40s, 50s. I think, a lot of, if we're going to look at social media marketing, that's depending on the platform, but most of it is aimed at very young people, like in their teens and 20s. And they're not at that point where they're like, I've tried this and none of that really has ever worked for me. It may have worked short term, but it's never actually led me to anything sustainable. So they're not worried about, they're just like, whatever we can give them, they'll give them the instantaneous results. And that's all. I mean, it's gross marketing.
But they're leveraging people's lack of ability to use these tools we're talking about, because naturally experience teaches you some of this. And the older you get, the more bad choices you've made. Like if you're 20, you just haven't had a lot of chance to fuck it up. You know, it's like you still got a lot of screwing it up in your 20s to do. And that's fine. And that's part of the process, no matter how good your cognitive skills are, right? That's just going to be part of that. Your brain is wired for that. You're not fully cooked. They're finding out until you're like 25 now, right? Yeah. So, I mean, that's a lot of processing you're doing through college. So it's like, if we're waiting until college to be giving people these tools and skills, we're not setting them up for success, right? We're not eliminating opportunities for them to make lots and lots of poor choices, which they're then going to have to unravel later. Right? Like, we're not doing a lot of favors here. So, again, it's the long game. It's playing the, we should be presenting this stuff as early as middle school, in my opinion. I don't know if you agree, Liz, but.
Absolutely. And what I will say is, and this is actually back to one of the very first things you said, Kris, I don't know that presenting it in this kind of intellectual way works, but what does work is giving it in stories. Right? Think about all the fables, all the fairy tales, right? These messages of the short term, like the shortcut never works, right? It's always about the long play, right? There's actually a lot of that built into these, again, fairy tales, fables, all of that young person's literature.
Interculturally as well. This is not a unique to Western culture concept.
Absolutely not. Right. All of life lessons are always embedded in children's literature and oral traditions, right? I mean, there's a reason for that.
And they're shockingly consistent across languages, cultures, and times. And there's actually, so again, in homeschool, I only homeschooled for a year, but I have a friend who's been homeschooling forever. And I've met a lot of homeschool families, and there are often different motivations for homeschooling. But this one friend I have is like the most educated person I think I know on literally almost every subject, right? And what she had found as a tool was this history book called The Story of the World. And the story of the world starts at the very beginning, right, of recorded history and goes through it. And not just from one cultural perspective, which I thought was super fascinating. And so this was one of my first opportunities going through these books and playing them, because they were audio tapes. So we would play them in the car, with just listening to them with my kid. And, the number of fables that would come up, literally, like you're saying, with the messaging. And then you'd hear a fable from another culture and it would be like, oh, that's the same message. Oh, look, there's another one. Slow and steady wins the race. Like, if you just want to use good old Aesop, great. But that message is consistent throughout time, culture, and language. It doesn't matter.
And go figure. That's the name of the game, right?
Yeah. You mean instant, quick fixes are not the way?
There's no
darn. Sorry, Dr. Oz.
Oh God, life hacks, right? My daughter's been watching all these life hack videos, and it's and she, I get it. It's gratifying, and it's super rewarding to think, oh gosh, I could just get this done, right? I could just achieve this thing without doing some of these other things I don't want to do. But the reality is, that's just unfortunately not the existence we got plugged into. Whatever matrix we're in, they put some rules in it, and these are some of them. So sorry, we watched the Resurrections the other day, and I was like geeking out on that in my brain. But I think this discussion
cheat codes don't work is really what it boils down to, right?
They don't work, right? There's no flying. You can't fly. Okay, it's sad, but true. But I think this discussion has been fantastic for tying up some of the topics that Liz and I have been kicking around. when it comes to some of her belief systems around food and eating and health, right? And why we all struggle, because we all struggle somewhere with this.
Right.
And when you step back and you realize it's about the messages that you've been hearing and what their motives are, that you can start to really distance yourself from that internally and say, okay, I understand why I believe this. And now I'm free to not believe it anymore if I choose.
Can I tell a little story? I was
course.
such a buzzkill when my son was little. He was like, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, like that time when like going to Target is just really hell because he always wanted to visit the toy aisle, and then he always wanted to buy the toy. And so we just started looking at the box of the Batman thing or the Hot Wheels thing or whatever the thing was. And I would be like, so it shows it going round and round and like zoom. Do you think it really does that? And we would talk about how somebody was trying to trick us into buying toys that didn't really do what they said they were going to do.
To have a moral philosophy professor for just a parent, right? I hope somebody out there watches The Good Place because
moral philosophers. Yes. But it got him to be a much more critical consumer of toys. And he was able to go, when they have like the little, the sparkly stars, that probably means it's not really flying off of the thing like that.
Yeah. Which when you think about a small child's like cognitive processing, that's exactly what they expect, right? Exactly. Because they're so trusting and believing because they haven't developed this experience level yet of skepticism of being let down by things. And that's such a sad thing to think about. But it is, also somewhat reality. And
it kind of came out of, buying disappointing toys and, it looked like the guy was going to go flying, but it just kind of flopped, right? And so that was part of it. It was like, that kind of stinks when it doesn't do what you think it's going to do. Let's maybe look really carefully here. Anyway, I was a total buzzkill.
That's great though, but but see, that's the thing. I think you were a buzzkill in the moment, but the killing of Buzz was there baked into the thing. You just did it now instead of letting him get it home. Right. And finding out that it was disappointing. And you asked him to ask himself questions, right? Which is literally the tools we're trying to build here.
Exactly.
Is like, hey, really try to genuinely get the reality of this situation, right? Is this really what you want? Does this really do the thing you think it's going to do?
Right.
Have you tried something similar that didn't do it? Yeah. And I think it's not fun, and I think we have a kind of joke in our house. We say that fun is shunned. And it's because of that. And because we've taught the same things. We've taught the critical thinking and we've looked at the instant gratification things and really asked our daughter to think critically about it and say, is this going to do what I think it's going to do? How long am I actually going to play with this toy?
Right.
What do I expect these dolls to do when I get them home? Do you think they walk around on their own? Because I remember asking her that at one point. She was like, yeah. I was like, okay, well, let's buy one and find out. It wasn't, no, it won't do that. I'm not there crushing dreams. Right. But also let's really assess this. Let's look at the reality of the situation versus the expectation that was set up.
Right.
Do they meet? And
if that doll is walking around on their own, I'm done.
You're done? That's a little Chucky, isn't it?
It gave me like Chucky vibes and I was like, nope.
But when you're 4,
yeah.
Right. Like when you're 4, it's this magical opportunity. There's so much magical possibility in the world for you because you don't understand the framework yet. And you don't have to because you have
or when you see
adults.
The commercial and the commercial, like it's doing the thing in the commercial.
Yeah. They're alive in the commercial.
Yeah.
Right. So, you start to realize this and it really changes. It does, I think, start to help you see the matrix and understand what's happening around you, because I think as adults, having been victims of this magical marketing, we still believe it can do it for us.
Why are there 8,000 life hacker articles? Right? We're still looking for the easy fix.
Why does Sprouts have 4 aisles of supplements? Why? It's like, okay, possibly there are some things that are somewhat beneficial, but it requires a certain amount of magical thinking to expect any oil from any plant to solve all of your problems, or any tea for that matter, and again, I'm pooping on parties here, but like, this is why we say in our house fun is shunned. And we have what we think is real fun. We have experiences and we go out in the world and we do things, right? Rather than buying things and expecting them to meet expectations, which is not immediately fun, right? Teaching my daughter to ski has not been immediately gratifying at all. I see so many other parents on the mountain and I'm like, oh, solidarity. Someday this is going to pay off, but it's not today. It's not today. Today, they're screaming on the mountain, I saw so many parents yesterday with like it's like a leash, basically. They put this harness on their kid and they're like power snow plowing and the kid is just like down the mountain as hard as they can. And it's like, oh, this is not fun for both parties, right? Like there's only some fun involved in that situation. And you're creating a false paradigm for that kid in some ways there, right? Like, and not to make critical thinking a buzzkill, because I think long-term it leads to sustainable happiness. It leads to real happiness, having a real take on what's going on and what the outcomes are going to be versus, just me selling you something that's going to shine something up temporarily. Life hacks shine things up temporarily.
I like that. That's a quote.
Bumper sticker right there.
Yeah.
That was my bumper sticker moment of the day. Other Liz found out that you used to be a ski instructor up at Eldora, which is how you knew where the bathrooms were when I needed them. Aha. Your husband dropped that today in conversation that you used to teach teeny tiny children how to ski.
Yes. And what I say about that is what made me a good teacher, especially of first timers, is that I didn't learn to ski until I was 40.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew what it was like to be like, holy shit. Right? Like I knew that experience in recent memory. And so I could hold people's hands through that experience and be like, yeah, it's kind of trippy when you feel like you're sliding down the mountain, but guess what? That's what it's all about.
Yeah.
That's cool. I really want to learn how to ski.
Oh, come on out.
I
got plenty of places.
That sounds awesome. It's so terrifying.
It's a good time.
But I think it's that beginner's mindset thing, right? You're talking about, I was a beginner recently, and it can be really hard once you've developed a skill to a certain level to remember what it was like to struggle with it. Or if you never had to develop that skill in the first place and you're trying to teach it. And this goes right back around to fitness marketing, where you see young, usually very young, single people in the gym talking about no break days, no off days. I never quit. I just push through. Like that's
I've never been injured.
I've never been injured. I don't have any other caretaking responsibilities that might prevent me from showing up today because somebody else needs something from me. There's 100 things there, but they also often struggle when they become coaches to help people with more complex realities navigate them because they can't put themselves in that beginner's mindset. They've never experienced it. And if they don't practice that empathizing or that ability to see the situation from somebody else's perspective, it's not super effective for the person. Right. So now you're paying a ton of money. And I've seen $5,000 programs from some of these influencers where they're literally selling you a list of exercises and a list of foods to eat. And although that may work for a really small percentage of people, the reality is that like, it's not knowledge they're lacking, right? Look at Bloom's taxonomy again. Knowledge is not usually where people get hung up. It's readily available. Whether it's accurate or not is the topic of the rest of today, but it's there. Yeah. Knowledge is not the problem, right? It's application. So this has been a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I am super excited about, what we've gotten out of today and just sort of the putting all of these components together. And, if you had to sort of sum it up, if you had a couple of takeaways for like why critical thinking is so important and what it can do for you, what would you say?
I guess it just helps you sort through the bullshit. That's the
That's a lot of bullshit.
And
to sort through.
there's so much. And I feel like that's, I don't know if we want to blame the internet or what, but I feel like there's so much more to be sorted through at an ever younger age. Again, I just feel like, certainly my child was not dealing with the volume of incoming information at the same age and rate as yours is, Kris. And, and there was nowhere near what I was, having to process through. And, by the time really my critical thinking skills were absolutely necessary, my brain was pretty well cooked. Right. And that's just not the case anymore. And I think that's one of the things that's so interesting. And I think that's why we're seeing just what you're saying about, like these mental health challenges for these really, really young people. And it's just, it's heartbreaking to me, quite frankly. And so, but, just again, as like, an adult person in the world, like it just helps you sort through the bullshit.
And even your own bullshit, because believe me, like your critical thinking skills are like you have some of your own bullshit and things to get you through whatever you're going through. It's really important to pull that shit out as well and have just like smear it around and like have a look at it. And, some of it you probably don't want to keep, most of it, if it's actually all shit. Right. So but sometimes you have sentimental shit that you need to keep. I feel very George Carlin right now with like their stuff is shit and my stuff is stuff. Yeah, that was it. Right. So I think that's a great takeaway. I think that really sums it up well. It's like, if you have some shit to sort out, this is a fantastic tool and you should do everything you can to get better at it.
Yeah.
You're here.